Hello and welcome to Literary Morning, a cozy bookish podcast to listen to while you sip your morning cup of tea. I'm Hannah, a stay-at-home mom of two who loves to read and talk about books, and I'm so glad you're here. If you were to ask me what is my favorite book of all time, of course there are several books I could choose from, but the one I always turn to is Watership Down by Richard Adams. There are so many reasons why I love this book and why it has meant so much to me throughout my life, and because of that, I have been wanting to reread it. I first read it in its entirety when I was 11 or 12, but since then I have read it several times when I was in high school, when I was in college, and I think it's due for another reread. Every time the experience gets richer and I get so much more out of it, and because of that, I wanted to take you along with me while I reread my favorite book of all time. This is going to be the first of what I hope to be a series on this podcast. This is a series that I am going to be calling Reader's Log. If you've ever watched reading vlogs or anything like that on YouTube, where a creator takes you along the journey as they read a book or a series, that's essentially what this is, but in audio format. I am going to be checking in with you every few days or so to give you my honest, authentic thoughts as I go through this reread. I will be sharing all of the things I'm highlighting, all of the thoughts I'm having as I'm reading, which I hope will be a fun experience on both ends for me to have a recording of my experience, but also for you to sort of learn more about my reading process, how I view my reading, what things I highlight and think about. So without further ado, I am so excited to start this read-through of Watership Down. If you want to read along with me, you're welcome to just read up to the point where I am and then pause and come back when you are caught up. There will be full spoilers for this. I'll try and keep them vague just in case, but I want to openly be able to talk about all the aspects of the story as I'm reading. I actually started reading the book last night. I picked it up and just immediately fell into the story. It's so familiar to me. It doesn't even feel like reading anymore. It just feels like coming home. I didn't get too far. I read through the introduction and the first couple chapters, but already I have so many notes written, so many things underlined that I wanted to talk about. So first up, I read the introduction by Richard Adams. So the introduction was added in 2005, it looks like, according to the copyright, but this is something that I always read through whenever I reread Watership Down. I feel like, personally, that the introduction adds just a deeper layer to the story. It makes you appreciate it so much more. There's so much lore behind Watership Down as a book itself that it is just so interesting to read every time. So for those of you who don't know anything about Watership Down, this is a story about rabbits, but it is so much more than that. It's not a children's book. I honestly don't love reading about anthropomorphic animals in any other sort of book, except for this one, because it is so different than anything else I've ever read. These rabbits are not only anthropomorphic, but they have such a rich culture to them that Richard Adams builds up. They have a religion, they have a language. It feels more like fantasy world building than just a simple tale about rabbits who talk. So this story came about because in the late 60s, early 70s, Richard Adams was on a road trip with his two children, and they asked him to tell them a story, and that story resulted in Watership Down. His children were the ones who encouraged him to write down the story and get it published. So all of this was just for his children. He wasn't intending to write a classic by any means. He just wanted a book that he could produce for his children to remember the time that they had on their road trip when he first told them this story. I love this line from the introduction. It says, "I never thought of the book becoming a bestseller, but I did think in terms of a modest hardback, which I could give to my daughter, saying, 'There you are, this is the book you wanted me to write.'" He also goes on in the introduction about his inspiration for different characters and how he thought through the rabbit language and different ways he changed the story to make it the way that it is. So it is all incredibly interesting from a writing perspective and from a world building perspective. And I highly recommend reading the introduction if you are reading the book. It's only like 4 or 5 pages, not long at all, but it is so worth it. I'm sure we'll talk more about this as I get further on in the story, but there's a lot of supposed commentary throughout the book about politics and the nature of humans, and Richard Adams always refutes those claims, even though I think they're probably added more subconsciously than he would admit. He does say in the introduction at the very end, "I want to emphasize that Watership Down was never intended to be some sort of allegory or parable. It is simply the story about rabbits made up and told in the car." Which I agree is probably true from his perspective, but I think our life experiences add to the stories that we tell, even if we don't intend them to. And I would argue that that's what happened with Watership Down. I think Richard Adams was living in a time where he had experienced or knew people who had experienced war and other significant events that happened in the 20th century. And I'm sure that those experiences wove their way in the story. I'm sure I'll have more to say on that later, but just wanted to talk about it up front in the introduction since it does come up. Now, getting into the first few chapters, I think it's so interesting the way the story starts. It sort of goes right into the action. There's not a lot of sitting with the rabbits in their lives, which I think is very good for this sort of story. I think it would be kind of boring if we meander a lot on the minutia of the rabbit life, but I think getting into the action and then learning more about the rabbit culture as they go on the journey is a much better way to do it. So the book starts with just this beautiful description of where they're living, and I love the way Richard Adams writes. I am always amazed that this was the first book he ever wrote. And from there we meet some of our main characters, Hazel and Fiver. Fiver is one of my all-time favorite characters. So Fiver is based off of the ancient Trojan prophetess myth of Cassandra, who is cursed to be a prophetess who will always tell the truth but will never be believed. If you know the Taylor Swift song Cassandra, that is what that is based off of as well. And when you know the story with Fiver and how he is, that also makes so much sense because he is the one who tries to warn the rabbits in their community that something bad is coming. He has these visions, and all the other rabbits think that he's crazy, that there's danger coming. The only one who believes him is Hazel, his brother, who knows that Fiver is sincere and genuine in his visions and that they usually are true. So the first couple chapters really do start with just establishing these characters. We get right away that Fiver has these visions and that something bad is coming, and Hazel wants to help him try to warn the other rabbits. The only other thing I wanted to mention in these first couple chapters is the introduction of the character Bigwig. I also absolutely love Bigwig as a character, one of my all-time favorite literary characters, and I love seeing him pop up already in the first couple chapters. Those are really my only updates right now. I will be back in a couple days after I've read some more to talk about any other lines or thoughts I had while reading. Alright, it's only been a couple days since I last updated on my reading, but I already have so much more I want to say. I feel like I have to stop myself from wanting to update on like every page that I read. But I am maybe about 60 pages through, and I was thinking, I don't think I gave a very great synopsis of this book earlier. I think I was just so excited that I brushed over a lot of things. This is a book about a group of rabbits, and one of the rabbits, named Fiver, is gripped with this feeling that danger is imminent. They must leave their home before something terrible happens. And no one in their community believes Fiver and what he has to say except for his brother and a very small group of reluctant followers. They all leave, and this is the story of their journey as they find a new home and establish a new community in this world of rabbits. It's set in the English countryside, so it is sort of set in our world, but not really, because we are following this new fantastically imagined culture of the rabbits. So that's a general synopsis of the story, in case there was any confusion about that. I am about 60 pages through so far, and like I said before, it's going so fast. I didn't remember how fast the events go by. In my mind, it takes a lot longer to get to certain scenes, but I'm already well into their journey to finding their new home. One thing I wanted to touch on today was the mythology that is woven throughout this story. It's one of my absolute favorite parts of this book. One of the reasons why it's my favorite is that Richard Adams creates a rabbit mythology. So every once in a while throughout the story, it'll stop and the rabbits will be telling a tale from their folklore about their great rabbit ancestors. And these stories really read like a fairy tale or folk tale. I can see why some people may not like them because it does kind of stall on the actual story, but I love them so much. And the first story comes just 20 or 30 pages into the book. They tell a story of the blessing of El Herrera, who is the great ancestor of all rabbits. He's sort of like this cunning trickster sort of rabbit creature who is the hero of a lot of their folk tales. And the story talks basically about how rabbits got their ability to run really fast and to hear really well, and those common characteristics that we know about rabbits and why they have so many enemies in the wild. The common hunters of rabbits throughout the story are known as the Thousand, because in this story they are cursed to have 1,000 enemies. And there's this really iconic line that comes out at the end of the story where Frith, the god of the rabbits, I guess, of the rabbit religion, and Frith says, "All the world will be your enemy, prince with 1,000 enemies, and whenever they catch you, they will kill you. But first they must catch you, digger, listener, runner, prince with the swift warning. Be cunning and full of tricks, and your people shall never be destroyed." That's just a very iconic line that I see all the time when people are referencing this book, so I wanted to shout it out. It comes pretty early in the book. I was kind of surprised. I didn't remember how soon that story came up, but I just wanted to talk about it and just in general the mythology going on with it. And I will talk to you in my next update, whenever that is. Alright, I am now a little bit further into the book, and I have so many more thoughts I want to share. So I got to the part in the book where the group of rabbits encounters what I like to think of as the rabbit cult. This is a community of rabbits that they stumble upon in their journey who live in this big warren, and they seem to have everything they could possibly want. They get fresh carrots, and they don't have to worry about enemies or anything like that. They're very advanced rabbits, and they write poetry and make art and all of these things that are so outlandish to our main characters who live a traditional rabbit life. And then we come to find out as they're spending time with this warren of rabbits that actually the reason that they don't have to worry about enemies is because there are people hunting the rabbits. So they are making sure all other predators are kept away from them in order to snare and catch them for themselves. And I just was so fascinated reading this scene again and just thinking about how comfort does not always equal freedom, how these rabbits think that they have everything that they could possibly want, and they don't understand when Hazel and the main group decide to leave because they think that they live in this rabbit paradise, but really they are being hunted and they are prisoners, I guess, in their own home. And it just made me think a lot about how we as people also often live like that. And even in my Bible reading this morning, it came up in the nonfiction book I'm reading along with my Bible reading that, comfort can often hinder our walk with God. How when we have everything we need and we love our comforts, it makes us less likely to turn to him. And I just loved how that related with what I was reading in Watership Down. And that's one of the reasons I love reading. I love when things connect like that, different themes that I can apply to my life and that I can think about even beyond just enjoying a fun adventure story. So I wanted to talk about that, and I love that scene. I think it's such an interesting scene. And again, just how Richard Adams explores even different parts of humanity through the rabbits. I also read up to the point where they finally get to Watership Down. They're setting up their new community. They're starting to build new burrows on Watership Down, and then they find Captain Hawley, who has escaped from their old warren that they left from, and they learn that Fiver's prediction was correct, that danger did come, that men came and washed out all of the burrows of all the rabbits, and that only Captain Hawley and Bluebell, another rabbit, survived. And this scene also just touches on more themes, the environmental themes of men and nature and how they can clash. It's just so interesting, and that's why I feel like this book, despite what Richard Adams says, is not just about rabbits. It makes you think so deeply. It's real and gritty, and I love it. So I wanted to touch on that a little bit more. That's where I'm at. Those are the things that I'm thinking on and taking away from this book. So it's another day, and I have another beautiful passage I wanted to share from the book. This is in the chapter, The Story of the Trial of El Herrera. Water is necessary to us, but a waterfall is not. Where it is to be found, it is something extra, a beautiful ornament. We need daylight, and to that extent it is utilitarian, but moonlight we do not need. When it comes, it serves no necessity. It transforms. And then later on in the paragraph it says, we do not take moonlight for granted. It is like snow or like the dew on a July morning. It does not reveal, but changes what it covers. I just wish I could write stuff like that. Just beautiful imagery, beautiful, thoughtful prose. I love it. But I am about halfway through the book at this point. I've been reading for about a week now. I am at the part where the rabbits are raiding the nearby farm to take some doe rabbits. They are settled on Watership Down with their own burrow, and they are really making it a home, its own warren, but they need does, obviously. They are all male rabbits right now. So they're raiding a farm to try and take some does. So that is where I'm at in the story, but I had a few other things I wanted to discuss. First of all, we got to meet the character Kihar, which is a very fun character. He is a seagull who gets wounded, and they take him in and nurse him back to health, and they are using him to scope out the nearby area in order to see if there are other warrens, and that is also how they found the farm, was through Kihar flying and finding them. And I just love the characterization of all of the characters, but Kihar is an especially vivid character. He speaks in a vernacular dialogue that is very unique, very distinctive, and definitely feels like how you would imagine a seagull talking. I wanted to bring up the introduction again because Richard Adams talks in the introduction about how he created his characters, and he addresses Kihar specifically and says, "As for Kihar the seagull, he was based on a Norwegian resistance fighter whom I had met during the war," and he talks about all of the characters and how they're based on real people that he knew. You can really feel that when you're reading, like they feel so real, even more so than other characters I've read in books that are actual human characters. And these are rabbits, but they have characteristics of people I feel like I could know in real life. And going off on the characters, I wanted to talk also a little bit about Hazel as a character. Hazel, I guess you could argue he is the main character of the book. There are a lot of prominent characters, but Hazel seems to be the one that we focus on a lot with his own internal thoughts and conflicts. And I just love Hazel as a character because you can see even now, like halfway through the book, he has sort of been established as the Warren's chief rabbit. Like, he is the leader. And you see shadows of that throughout the first half of the book, where he's addressed as the chief rabbit several times by other rabbits that they meet along the way, or his companions turn to him for leadership, even though he doesn't himself put himself in the role of chief rabbit. It just sort of happens naturally. There's not a power struggle among the rabbits. They just all accept that Hazel is their leader, and they trust him, and Hazel is the type of leader I would want to be. I feel like he's very quiet and thoughtful. He's very loyal to the rabbits that he lives with, and he cares for them and wants what's best for them. And on the other end, we have Bigwig, who is more of what you would traditionally think of as a leader, and he has that leadership experience being part of, I guess, the brute squad. I guess you could describe them in their old Warren. Bigwig worked for the chief rabbit in the Warren, and so he's strong, he's big, he's forceful, the type of character you would expect to be the leader of this group. But Bigwig himself submits to Hazel and is happy to follow whatever he tells him to do. And Bigwig is also just a very loyal character, and you can tell he would give his life to protect the community that they've created. Hello and welcome to Literary Bedtime, because I am 100% recording this clip from my bed. I am getting ready to go to sleep soon, but I wanted to record a quick update because it's been a few days. I haven't been able to read as much as I would usually like to the past few days. We've been spending time with family and things have just been busy, but I have read quite a bit since my last update, at least. I'm on chapter 35. I won't summarize everything that's happened since my last update, but we are finally reaching the sort of climax of the book. We have now met a new community of rabbits in a warren called Ephrafa, and Ephrafa is what I like to think of as like the Nazi rabbits. We met a community early on in the book that I think of as like the rabbit cult, and this is like the rabbit Third Reich, where it's a very large warren, but they have very strict rules. Every rabbit has a different mark, and that dictates when they can go up to feed or when they, or like what their class is in the community, and it's very strict. Rabbits aren't allowed to leave or join, really, and their ruler is the main antagonist of the later half of the book, and that is General Woundwort. He's very brutal, hard-hearted rabbit who has lived a very rough life, and he pretty much just takes it out on everyone in his community, and he has a very tight control over this warren, and everyone in their warren really respects him and is scared of him and listens to him. And honestly, I don't blame them, because General Woundwort is a pretty scary character. So there is a cartoon version of Watership Down, and maybe I'll talk more about it later, I don't know, but General Woundwort is a very sort of scary figure in that cartoon adaptation, and people who have watched the movie as children just remember being terrified of him, which is a whole other thing. I think I'll talk about the adaptations when I do my overall wrap-up, but I just wanted to shout it out there. One thing I did not realize is that the book gives like a pretty detailed backstory to General Woundwort, which I did not remember at all. Basically, when he was like a little baby bunny, his mother passed away. I think his mother and father are killed, and he is left alone as a baby rabbit, and he's taken in by a human who nurses him back to health and strength, but he is just a very wild at heart creature and is automatically just very vicious against the world. There's more to it, but that's the gist of his backstory. But I did not remember at all that his origins were really explored much in the book, so that was interesting to read again and remember, and just, we're building up to the more exciting parts of the book where our main characters are going to go infiltrate Ephrafa and try to take some of the does from this warren. They started out with trying to reason with Woundwort, and they tried to amicably offer to take some of the does with them since their warren is pretty overrun, but of course General Woundwort is very much against that plan and wants to keep control of all of the rabbits he possibly can. So now our main characters are trying to hatch an escape plan for some of the does who want to escape and have a better life outside in a new warren. So that's where we're at. Bigwig is now trying to join Ephrafa to take it down from the inside. So very interesting, very exciting. I'm still very much enjoying it, loving the writing. In the chapter called The Great River, there was just beautiful imagery of the nature around the downs in the English countryside, which I loved. Something else I wanted to briefly mention before I sign off for today is that I decided to read the graphic novel of Watership Down along with my reread. I've had this graphic novel for a while now, and I've just been waiting for the perfect time to read it. And what better time than now, so I can read it along with the original source material and use it as a visual guide to what I'm reading to really stick it in my brain to see what's going on. And I am loving it. I love the illustrations. It just beautifully represents what I would imagine Watership Down to be like, much more so than the cartoon. I feel like the cartoon makes it look a little bit too cutesy, but this graphic novel is done very well, where you can see it's more gritty and dark in its design. But yeah, I'm really enjoying that. It's just making it way more of an immersive experience, which I love. I posted a little snapshot image of the graphic novel on Instagram, so if you want to take a peek at what the artwork looks like, you can go see it there. But I will give my full detailed thoughts on the graphic novel when I do my full wrap-up on my reading experience at the end. So I finished the book this morning, so let's talk about the ending and wrap up this whole experience rereading Watership Down. I feel like I always get so emotional reading the end of this book. Every single time. Just the build-up to the climax of the book and just the way it ends. I love it so much. So from where I left off in my last update, Bigwig and the other rabbits are able to help some does escape from Ephrafa, and they bring them back to Watership Down, and they're living their life, but then General Woundwort and his Ausla, or his army, track them down to essentially get revenge on all the rabbits who essentially stole their does from them. You get this really exciting back and forth with Bigwig trying to protect the warren and the does and baby rabbits who are there, from General Woundwort and his army, but then you also are flashing to scenes with Hazel and trying to release this dog from the nearby farm to come and attack the opposing rabbit army. It's just such an exciting ending, such an exciting scene. My absolute favorite scene in the whole book is in the chapter The Sky Suspended. It's one of the very last chapters, and it's when Bigwig is facing up to General Woundwort, and the general is trying to get him to back down and to come and join his army. But you just see Bigwig's resilience and loyalty so much in this scene, where even though he's like on his last leg, the last bit of his strength, he says, "My chief rabbit has told me to defend this run, and until he says otherwise, I shall stay here." Just like how much he respects Hazel as the chief rabbit and how he wants to protect what they've built. I just love it so much. It makes me emotional every time. So in the midst of all this, Hazel is actually attacked by the cat at the farm, and he is rescued by a little girl. And there is one chapter in this whole book that is from the perspective of an actual human, which is this little girl. You see evidence of this conflict throughout the whole book of men versus nature and how they clash. And just when they finally interact, you see it through the innocence of a young girl and how she saves Hazel and lets him go back to his home. And I also thought that that was a nice nod to the fact that Richard Adams wrote this book for his daughters when they were young. And then also you get a little cameo from Richard Adams himself as Dr. Adams. I thought that was funny. I didn't remember that part, but I had to make a note of that when I was annotating, that he sort of self-inserts himself as the doctor character who advises the little girl to let him go so that Hazel can return to his warren. It just wraps up everything so beautifully. And then you get to see the afterword where they're having rabbit kittens, and they're growing up and hearing the stories, and how Hazel and Bigwig and Fiver, they have now become legends in and of themselves, just like we've seen the legends of El Herrera throughout the whole book. It just ties up everything so perfectly, and maybe it is a clean ending for a book that has such dark and often heavy themes, but I love it. I don't know how much I can say I love it. So overall, I love this experience. It's still definitely one of my favorite books of all time, and I could not recommend it enough. It's not a book that will necessarily appeal to everyone, but there's a lot to it that gives it so much merit and makes you really think. And for that, I think it is worth reading for anyone. It is a very weird book when you think about it. It's a book about small animals that you would normally see depicted in children's literature, which is why it's so often misunderstood, I think. People either go into it expecting it to be lighter and will either be put off by the heaviness of it, or will make them intrigued and read more. But I think that is also why it has been such a difficult book to adapt throughout the years. As I mentioned briefly before, there was a cartoon version of the book made shortly after it was published, and you hear a lot of people reference that movie as nightmare fuel, like it's something that they watched as a young child and was terrifying to them because you see the rabbits and they're being vicious and violent toward each other, and especially General Woundwort. But honestly, my hot take is that I actually really like that adaptation. I think it sticks to the feel of the book very well. I just think with what they were trying to do, they did the absolute best that they could. But I don't think it will ever have a perfect adaptation because of all the weirdness surrounding the book. I know Netflix also did an adaptation that I watched part of, and I liked it. I haven't finished it, so I don't really have strong opinions on it. It has like a pretty big cast, like with James McAvoy and all of that. But I do have a soft spot in my heart for the original animated version, as weird as it is, because it does depict the book very well. Now, along with all of that, I wanted to talk about the graphic novel as well that I have been reading in tandem with the novel, and I have not quite finished that yet, but I'm very close. But I think it is also a very great adaptation of the book. I don't think I would recommend you start with the graphic novel just because there is so much context and lore that you miss out on when you're just reading the graphic novel that's just dependent on the dialogue from the book. But I think it is very true to what Richard Adams did in the novel, and I think it's a great resource for whenever I'm craving the story, want to read it, but don't have time to read the full book. I can just quickly read through the graphic novel whenever I want, and with the visuals, it feels like way more immersive since I already know the story and the characters so well. It just makes it so much more alive, and I'm really enjoying it. So my final thoughts. Why do I love Watership Down so much? Besides my nostalgia surrounding this story, it's something I come back to time and time again. It's something I think about all the time because it is so unlike anything I have ever read before. It's a fantasy book, but it is so rooted in our world, and the rabbits don't do anything that real rabbits wouldn't do. In the introduction, again, Adams talks about how he really heavily relied on an expert on rabbits because he wanted them to feel real, and they really do. There's no magic or crazy things that happen besides what happens in the fairy tales that they tell. And because of that, you can really imagine that rabbits are actually talking to each other like this, and they have their own mythology and traditions and hierarchies within their communities. And because of that, it really sticks with you with how real it feels, even though it's a fictional story, as well as just the characters being so lifelike, despite the fact that they're rabbits. I could go on, and I know I've already said most of this throughout the episode, but I love this book. It's one book that I don't understand any criticism for. I think it's the type of novel that comes around like once in a lifetime, just so creative and beautifully told, even though this was a debut novel. I know this was a very niche book to bring today to read through. I honestly don't know how many people will listen all the way through to the end. I think when I do these sort of episodes in the future, I'll do like classics or more popular books so that people will be more interested, but I wanted to start with a book that means so much to me so that you can better understand how I read through books and what sticks out for me in what I read and what I love. So I hope you've enjoyed following along this journey. If I have convinced one person to pick up Watership Down and give it a try, even if they don't like it, that would make me so happy. Thank you so much for listening and spending time with me today. You can connect with me and follow the show at Literary Morning on Instagram for all the latest news and updates. Show notes for this episode and more can be found at literarymorning.com. Did you love this episode? Be sure to leave a 5-star review or share it with a friend. Your love and support means the world. I hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you're listening, and I'll talk to you again very soon.